Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The gravel crunched beneath our boots as we made our way down the winding trail toward Cabin 7. November 2019 had brought an early frost to the Adirondack Mountains, and the bare branches overhead created a skeletal canopy against the gray afternoon sky. My 18-year-old daughter Megan walked beside me, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air as she took in her first glimpse of the remote camp that had been part of my life for over 3 decades. "It's really isolated out here, Dad," she said, adjusting her backpack straps as we navigated around a fallen branch that had partially blocked the narrow path. I nodded, remembering my own first impression of this place back in 1987 when I was just a college freshman. The camp, owned by my alma mater, consisted of 10 rustic cabins scattered throughout nearly 200 acres of pristine wilderness. Each structure was positioned strategically to provide maximum privacy, connected only by a network of hiking trails that meandered through towering pines and hardwood groves. The quarter-mile walk from the parking area felt longer than usual, weighed down as we were with supplies for our 3-day retreat. I had specifically requested Cabin 7 because it sat in what the camp staff called the Glade, a small clearing surrounded by ancient hemlocks that created a natural amphitheater of sorts. A thin walking path continued past the cabin's front porch, eventually leading to the more remote cabins deeper in the woods. As we approached our destination, I felt the familiar sense of peace that always accompanied my arrival here. The cabin's rustic construction was a testament to early American craftsmanship. Massive logs hewn directly from the surrounding forest, fitted together with such precision that they had weathered decades of harsh mountain winters. The structure seemed to grow organically from the forest floor, as if it had always been part of this landscape. "Wow, it really is like stepping back in time," Megan observed, running her hand along the smooth surface of one of the porch support posts. The covered porch stretched across the entire front of the cabin, its wooden railing weathered to a silvery gray. Built into the left side of the railing was a sturdy wood rack, constructed of thick horizontal slats designed to hold split logs off the ground. I fished the old brass key from my jacket pocket and unlocked the heavy wooden door. The hinges creaked as it swung open, releasing the familiar scent of aged wood and cold ash from the massive stone fireplace that dominated the main room. The interior was spartanly furnished but comfortable, 2 well-worn leather couches arranged around the hearth, a solid oak dining table, and a galley kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s. "No electricity?" Megan asked, noting the absence of light switches or outlets. "Propane lanterns only," I confirmed, pointing to the brass fixtures mounted on the log walls. "And no running water either. See that blue container by the sink? That's our water supply for the next 3 days." She examined the 10-gallon plastic jug positioned to the left of the simple porcelain sink, which was set into a wooden counter against the far wall. The primitive conditions were part of the camp's charm, designed to encourage disconnection from the modern world and reconnection with simpler pleasures. Behind the main room, a narrow hallway led to 2 small bedrooms, each furnished identically with twin beds positioned against opposite walls and a single window centered between them. The beds were covered with thick wool blankets that smelled faintly of cedar from the storage chests where they spent the off-season. "I call the left bed," Megan announced, dropping her duffel bag on the mattress nearest the exterior wall. "Works for me," I replied, though I couldn't shake a vague uneasiness about her choice. The window between our beds looked out into dense forest, where the last rays of afternoon sunlight were already beginning to fade between the tree trunks. We spent the next hour unloading our supplies and settling in. I showed Megan how to operate the propane lanterns and explained the quirks of the old wood-burning stove in the kitchen. By the time we had finished organizing our gear, the temperature inside the cabin had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath when I exhaled. "Time to earn our warmth," I announced, grabbing the splitting axe from its hook beside the back door. One of the camp traditions is that every guest splits their own firewood. Good exercise and guarantees you'll appreciate the heat. Outside, a neat pile of seasoned logs waited beside the chopping block, positioned about 50 yards behind the cabin. The wood had been cut from trees that had fallen naturally in recent storms, part of the camp's sustainable forestry practices. As we worked, taking turns with the heavy axe, I found myself frequently glancing toward the tree line. The forest seemed unusually quiet for this time of day, lacking the typical sounds of small animals foraging for winter provisions. Megan proved surprisingly adept with the axe, her college softball training evident in her smooth, powerful swing. Within 30 minutes, we had accumulated enough split wood to last through the cold night ahead, plus extra for the following day. As we carried armloads of the fragrant pine and oak back to the cabin, the sun finally disappeared behind the western ridgeline, plunging the glade into premature twilight. Loading the wood onto the stone hearth inside, I built our first fire with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. The kindling caught quickly, followed by progressively larger pieces until flames danced cheerfully in the firebox. We arranged the excess wood in the rack on the porch, stacking it carefully to promote air circulation and prevent moisture buildup. By the time we had finished our preparations, full darkness had settled over the camp. The only illumination came from our fire and the soft glow of a single propane lantern I had lit above the kitchen counter. Outside, the November night pressed against the windows like a living thing, and the temperature continued its steady descent toward what the weather forecast had predicted would be a record-breaking low for this date. "I can see why you love it here," Megan said as we settled onto one of the couches I had turned to face the fireplace. "It's like the rest of the world doesn't exist." I nodded, opening the paperback novel I had brought for the trip. The isolation was indeed one of the camp's greatest attractions. No cell phone service, no internet, no distractions from the constant connectivity that defined modern life. Here, time moved at the pace of burning logs and turning pages, measured by the gradual accumulation of glowing coals rather than digital clocks. We cooked our dinner on the wood stove, a simple meal of roasted chicken and vegetables that tasted infinitely better in this setting than it would have in any restaurant. The only sounds were the crackling of burning wood and the occasional settling creaks of the old cabin adjusting to the dropping temperature. Even the wind had died away, leaving us in a bubble of perfect silence. As we cleaned up after dinner, I caught myself listening for sounds from outside. Not from any sense of danger, but from long habit. In 30 years of visits to this camp, I had heard every variety of night sound these mountains could produce. The haunting calls of loons from distant lakes, the rustle of deer moving through underbrush, the sharp crack of branches breaking under the weight of snow or ice. Tonight, however, the forest remained eerily quiet, as if every living creature had decided to remain hidden. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. The combination of crisp mountain air, physical exertion from splitting wood, and the hypnotic warmth of the dying fire created perfect conditions for deep, dreamless rest. I woke naturally as pale dawn light filtered through the frost-covered windows, feeling refreshed and eager to share this special place with my daughter. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped considerably during the night. I could see my breath clearly as I quietly rebuilt the fire from the cold ashes. The ritual of coaxing flames back to life from buried embers always gave me a sense of primitive satisfaction, connecting me to generations of humans who had performed the same essential task. Megan emerged from the bedroom as the coffee began percolating on the wood stove, her hair tousled and her cheeks pink from the cold. "I can't believe how quiet it was," she said, wrapping herself in one of the wool blankets from her bed. "I usually need some kind of background noise to fall asleep, but last night was different. The silence was almost comfortable." After a hearty breakfast of scrambled eggs and bacon cooked on the old cast iron stove, we set out to explore the broader camp property. I wanted to show Megan some of the other cabins where I had stayed over the years, each with its own character and history. The morning air was sharp and clean, scented with pine resin and the earthy smell of decomposing leaves. We hiked the main trail that connected all 10 cabins, stopping to examine the architectural details that made each structure unique. Cabin 3, where I had stayed during my honeymoon 25 years earlier, featured an elaborate stone chimney decorated with fossils found on the property. Cabin 9, perched on a small bluff overlooking a beaver pond, had been built entirely from American chestnut logs, now an impossibly rare and valuable wood. The clouds had thickened during our walk, and by the time we returned to Cabin 7 around noon, a light drizzle had begun to fall. I quickly rebuilt our fire while Megan prepared sandwiches for lunch. The cabin felt wonderfully cozy as we settled back onto the couch with our simple meal, listening to the gentle patter of raindrops on the roof. "I understand now why you've been coming here for so long," Megan said, curling up in the corner of the couch with her book. "There's something almost addictive about the simplicity. No decisions to make except when to add wood to the fire and what to read next." I smiled, remembering my own first experience of this place and how it had instantly become a refuge from the complexities of academic life. Over the decades, I had brought roommates, girlfriends, and eventually my wife to this camp. Megan was the first of my children to show interest in joining me, and I was grateful she seemed to appreciate what made this place special. We spent the afternoon reading in comfortable silence, occasionally commenting on our books or feeding another log to the fire. The rain continued steadily but gently, creating a soothing background rhythm that made the warm interior feel even more welcoming. Every so often, I would glance up from my pages to watch my daughter, noting how the firelight softened her features and gave her an almost timeless appearance. She could have been any young woman from any era, seeking solace and wisdom in the pages of a book beside a warming fire. As evening approached, the rain tapered off, leaving the forest glistening with moisture. I lit several of the wall-mounted propane lanterns, casting a warm, steady glow throughout the main room. We prepared a more elaborate dinner than the previous night: pasta with meat sauce, garlic bread warmed on the wood stove, and a bottle of wine I had been saving for a special occasion. "To new traditions," I toasted as we sat down at the oak table. "To new traditions," Megan agreed, clinking her glass against mine. The meal was leisurely, and conversation flowed easily between us. We talked about her plans after college graduation, my memories of my own early career, and the changes we had both noticed in the world over the past few years. The wine and warmth of the cabin created an atmosphere of intimate honesty that rarely occurred in our normal daily interactions. As we cleaned up after dinner, I found myself feeling genuinely content. This trip was accomplishing exactly what I had hoped, providing quality time with my daughter while introducing her to a place that had shaped so many of my most treasured memories. The rain had stopped completely, and through the windows I could see stars beginning to appear between the dispersing clouds. "Perfect timing," I observed, nodding toward the clearing sky. "Tomorrow should be ideal hiking weather." Megan yawned and stretched, the combination of fresh air, wine, and the hypnotic warmth of the fire making her drowsy. "I think I'm ready for bed," she announced. "That mountain air really takes it out of you." I banked the fire carefully, ensuring enough coals would survive to make morning fire starting easier, and followed her toward the bedrooms. As I prepared for sleep, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction with how the trip was progressing. Megan seemed genuinely enchanted with the camp, and we were building exactly the kind of shared experience I had hoped for. Outside, the forest had returned to its profound nighttime quiet. No wind stirred the branches, no animals called to each other across the darkness. The silence was so complete it seemed almost solid, wrapping around the cabin like a protective blanket. As I drifted toward sleep, I remember thinking that this might be one of the most peaceful places left on Earth. I was completely unprepared for what the next day would bring. The second day dawned crisp and clear, with brilliant sunshine streaming through windows still etched with delicate frost patterns. I woke feeling energized and optimistic, eager to continue showing Megan the hidden treasures of the camp property. After rebuilding the fire and starting coffee, I stepped onto the front porch to assess the weather conditions for our planned longer hike. The air was so clean and sharp it seemed to cut into my lungs with each breath. Every detail of the surrounding forest stood out with startling clarity. Individual needles on the pine boughs, the intricate patterns of bark on the oak trees, the crystalline droplets of moisture still clinging to spiderwebs stretched between branches. It was the kind of perfect autumn morning that makes you grateful to be alive and aware. Megan emerged from the cabin carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her cheeks already pink from the cold air. "It's like a postcard out here," she said, handing me one of the cups and settling onto the porch railing beside me. We spent a pleasant hour planning our day's adventure over breakfast, studying the hand-drawn trail map that had been left in the cabin by previous guests. I wanted to show her the old fire tower on the property's highest peak, a remnant from the days when forest fires posed a constant threat to these mountains. The hike would take most of the morning, but the views from the top were spectacular on a clear day like this. By mid-morning, we had packed day packs with water and snacks and set out on the trail that wound up the mountainside behind the cabin. The path was well maintained, but challenging, climbing steadily through groves of birch and maple trees that had dropped their leaves to create a thick golden carpet beneath our feet. Megan proved to be an excellent hiking companion, maintaining a steady pace while pointing out interesting rock formations and wildlife signs along the way. The fire tower, when we finally reached it after 2 hours of climbing, was even more impressive than I had remembered. Built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, the steel structure rose 60 feet above the tree line, offering panoramic views of the entire Adirondack region. We climbed the metal stairs to the observation platform, where a rusty logbook invited visitors to record their impressions. "This is incredible," Megan breathed, slowly turning to take in the 360-degree vista of mountains, lakes, and forest stretching to the horizon in every direction. I had no idea the camp was situated in such spectacular country. I pointed out various landmarks visible from our elevated perch: the lake where I had learned to canoe as a college student, the ridgeline that marked the boundary of the state park, the distant peaks where serious mountaineers tested their skills against some of the Northeast's most challenging climbs. For nearly an hour, we remained on the platform, sharing stories and simply absorbing the magnificent scenery. The hike back down to Cabin 7 took less time than the ascent, but our legs were definitely feeling the effects of the morning's exertion by the time we reached the familiar clearing. The sun had climbed high enough to warm the air considerably, and we were both grateful to settle onto the front porch for a rest before preparing lunch. "I need to get that fire going again," I said, noting that the interior of the cabin felt noticeably cooler than when we had left. "Should have banked it better before we headed out." Inside, I knelt before the stone hearth and began the process of coaxing flames back to life from the few remaining embers buried in the ash. The wood I had left on the hearth that morning was bone dry and caught quickly, soon producing the cheerful crackling sound that had become the soundtrack to our stay. Within minutes, warmth began radiating from the fireplace, and the cabin regained its welcoming atmosphere. Megan had taken her customary position on the couch, book in hand, when we both heard it. The sound came from directly behind us, outside the cabin but very close. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, a rolling, rumbling noise that seemed to move from left to right across what I knew had to be the front porch. My first thought was that one of the logs from the wood rack had somehow shifted and rolled across the wooden decking, but something about the sound felt wrong. It was too deliberate, too controlled to be a simple case of gravity acting on an unstable piece of firewood. Megan and I locked eyes immediately, both of us frozen in position on the couch. "Did you hear that?" I asked, though her expression made the question unnecessary. "Yes," she whispered. but it sounded like it came from back there. She pointed toward the rear of the cabin, which confused me because I was certain the sound had originated from the front porch area. I stood up slowly, my heart rate accelerating as I tried to process what we had just experienced. In all my years of visiting this camp, I had become familiar with every sound the forest could produce. Falling branches, small animals scurrying through underbrush, the occasional larger mammal moving through the vicinity. This sound was different. It had an intentional quality that suggested intelligence behind it. Probably just some other guests walking along the trail, I said. Though even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. The rolling sound hadn't been footsteps, and it had come from the porch itself, not the walking path that passed 15 feet away from the cabin's front steps. I moved to the window and peered out toward the trail, expecting to see hikers, or perhaps some of the camp maintenance staff making their rounds. The forest was completely empty. No movement, no signs of human presence, no indication that anyone else was anywhere in the vicinity. Returning to where Megan sat, I could see fear beginning to creep into her expression. Her book lay forgotten in her lap, and her eyes had taken on a wide, alert quality that reminded me of how deer look when they sense a predator nearby. "I better take a look outside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and reassuring. The last thing I wanted was for this incident to ruin what had been a perfect trip so far. I walked to the hearth and selected a piece of split wood about 3 feet long. Not quite a weapon, but something solid I could swing if the situation required it. The weight of the hardwood in my hands provided a small measure of comfort as I approached the front door. "I'll be right back," I told Megan, though I noticed my voice sounded less confident than I had intended. The brass doorknob felt cold under my palm as I turned it slowly, listening for any sounds from the other side. The hinges creaked as I opened the door just wide enough to slip through, then closed it behind me with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. I stood on the threshold for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the bright sunlight after the relative dimness of the cabin interior. Every detail of the porch appeared exactly as it should. The wood rack still neatly stacked with split logs, the railing showing its normal pattern of weathered wood grain, the decking clean except for a few scattered leaves that had fallen during our morning hike. Taking 2 deliberate steps onto the porch proper, I turned first to my left, scanning the area where the trail emerged from the forest. Nothing moved among the trees, and I could see far enough along the path to confirm that no other hikers were approaching or departing. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I turned to the right, toward the wood rack where I believed the sound had originated. What I saw in that moment changed everything I thought I understood about the nature of reality. Hovering approximately 3 feet above the carefully stacked logs in the wood rack was something that defied every category my rational mind tried to impose upon it. At first glance, it resembled a tentacle from some massive sea creature, thick as my forearm at the base, tapering to a more slender tip, perhaps 4 feet in length overall. But this was no marine animal displaced to an Adirondack forest. The surface appeared to be a mottled light brown color marked with irregular white spots, while the underside showed a pale, almost translucent quality. Most unsettling of all, the entire form seemed to shift and shimmer as I stared at it, as if it existed only partially in the physical world I recognized. It possessed a luminous quality that reminded me of heat mirages rising from summer pavement, but far more substantial and purposeful. The moment my eyes fully focused on this impossible apparition, it reacted to my presence with startling intelligence. The appendage quickly withdrew, pulling back around the corner of the cabin with smooth, fluid motion that suggested complete awareness of being observed. There was nothing random or instinctive about its movement. This thing had been watching me just as intently as I was now watching it. What happened next taught me the true meaning of paralyzing terror. I had always been somewhat skeptical when reading accounts of people who claimed to be frozen with fear, assuming it was simply a dramatic exaggeration. Now I understood that it was a literal physiological response. Every muscle in my body locked simultaneously, as if my nervous system had simply stopped communicating with my limbs. My brain continued functioning normally, racing through possible explanations and screaming at my body to move, to investigate, to do something other than stand there like a statue. But my feet might as well have been nailed to the wooden porch decking. The split log I had brought for protection hung useless in my grip, my arm too rigid to raise it even if I had wanted to. The rational part of my mind desperately sought conventional explanations. Could it have been some kind of atmospheric phenomenon? Perhaps heat distortion from the warming day creating optical illusions. Might it have been an unusually large snake, though no serpent species in this region grew to such proportions or possessed that particular coloration? Was there any possibility of an elaborate prank being perpetrated by other camp guests, though the technology required for such a hoax seemed far beyond anything readily available? None of these explanations felt adequate to what I had witnessed. The thing I had seen possessed a quality of undeniable presence, a substance that transcended any trick of light or shadow. It had moved with purpose and intelligence, responding to my appearance with what could only be described as conscious intent. Time seemed suspended as I stood there, locked in place by a primal fear that bypassed all rational thought. It might have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes. My perception had become so distorted that I lost all sense of duration. The only sounds were my own ragged breathing and the thunderous pounding of my heart, which seemed loud enough to echo off the surrounding trees. Gradually, as if emerging from some kind of hypnotic trance, I began to regain control over my body. The paralysis released slowly, starting with my fingers and working outward until I could once again move my arms and shift my weight from foot to foot. The relief of restored mobility was overwhelming, but it brought with it an even stronger urge to flee back to the safety of the cabin's interior. My first instinct was to retreat immediately, to put the solid walls of the cabin between myself and whatever I had encountered. But another part of my mind, the part trained by decades of academic inquiry to seek evidence and verify observations, insisted that I needed to investigate further. If I ran now without examining the scene, I would spend the rest of my life wondering if I had imagined the entire incident. Fighting against every survival instinct screaming at me to escape, I forced myself to walk toward the corner of the porch where the apparition had vanished. Each step required enormous effort, as if I were moving through thick mud rather than empty air. My hands trembled as I gripped the porch railing for support, and cold sweat had begun forming on my forehead despite the warm afternoon sunshine. When I reached the corner and peered around the edge of the cabin, I found exactly what I had expected and dreaded. Nothing. No trace of the impossible thing I had witnessed, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred in this spot. The ground beneath where it had hovered showed no impressions, no disturbances in the thick layer of fallen leaves that carpeted the forest floor. I knelt down and examined the area more carefully, looking for any physical signs that might explain what I had seen. The earth beneath the wood rack was soft with recent moisture, perfect for preserving footprints or other marks. If a person had been standing here playing some kind of elaborate trick, there should have been clear evidence of their presence. Instead, I found only the natural accumulation of twigs, leaves, and forest debris that covered every square inch of the woodland floor. Standing up, I noticed something that sent another chill through my already agitated nervous system. Scattered around the base of the wood rack were numerous small branches and twigs that would have made any approach by a human being audibly obvious. Anyone walking through this area would have created a symphony of snapping and crackling sounds that I certainly would have heard from inside the cabin. Yet the rolling sound that had drawn my attention had been completely isolated. No accompanying footsteps or rustling vegetation. This observation forced me to confront an uncomfortable conclusion. Whatever I had seen could not have been produced by any conventional human presence. The physical evidence simply didn't support that explanation, leaving me to grapple with possibilities that challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality. Knowing that I needed to conduct a thorough examination of the entire area before returning to face my daughter's questions, I began a systematic circuit of the cabin's perimeter. My academic training and research methodology proved useful even in this bizarre situation. I would document everything I found, or more importantly, everything I didn't find. Starting from the front porch, I moved clockwise around the structure, examining every square foot of ground for any evidence of human intrusion. The cabin sat in a roughly circular clearing about 50 yards in diameter, surrounded by dense forest that would make silent approach nearly impossible. Any person attempting to reach the building without using the established trail would have had to push through thick underbrush, inevitably leaving a trail of broken vegetation and disturbed earth. The soft soil around the cabin's foundation showed only the expected impressions. My own footprints from our wood-splitting activity the previous day, Megan's smaller tracks from when she had explored the area that morning, and the occasional paw prints of small woodland creatures going about their normal business. There were no human footprints other than our own, no trampled vegetation, no broken branches that might indicate someone had been lurking in the vicinity. As I completed my circuit and returned to the front porch, I felt a growing sense of unreality about the entire situation. The evidence clearly indicated that no other person had been near the cabin, yet I had undeniably witnessed something that appeared to possess intelligence and intent. The logical contradiction was maddening. My eyes and my scientific training were presenting me with incompatible conclusions. I climbed the steps back onto the porch and stood for a moment in the exact spot where I had first seen the apparition. In the bright afternoon sunlight, with birds beginning to resume their normal activities in the surrounding trees, the entire incident seemed almost dreamlike. Had I really seen what I thought I had seen? Could stress, altitude, or some other factor have caused a hallucination so vivid and detailed? But even as I tried to rationalize the experience, I couldn't shake the memory of how real it had appeared, how purposefully it had moved, how intelligently it had responded to my presence. Whatever I had witnessed possessed a quality of undeniable authenticity that no amount of logical analysis could dismiss. Taking a deep breath to compose myself, I opened the cabin door and stepped back inside. Megan was still sitting on the couch, but her posture had changed dramatically. Where before she had been relaxed and comfortable, now she sat rigidly upright, her book closed and forgotten beside her. Her eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that told me she was reading every detail of my expression for clues about what I had discovered. "Well?" she asked, her voice pitched higher than normal. "Did you find anything?" I closed the door behind me and leaned against it for a moment, trying to decide how much to tell her. The last thing I wanted was to frighten her unnecessarily, but I also couldn't simply pretend that nothing had happened. She had heard the same sound I had, and my extended absence had clearly given her time to work herself into a state of considerable anxiety. "I saw something," I said finally, choosing my words carefully. "Something unusual." Her eyes widened, and she leaned forward on the couch. "What kind of something?" I moved to the window and looked out toward the wood rack, half expecting to see the apparition materialize again in broad daylight. The porch appeared completely normal, with afternoon sunlight casting familiar shadows through the surrounding trees. "I'm not entirely sure," I admitted, turning back to face her. It was unlike anything I've ever seen before. It appeared to be floating above the wood rack, and when it noticed me watching, it disappeared around the corner of the cabin. "Floating?" Megan's voice cracked slightly on the word. I nodded, still holding the piece of split wood I had carried outside for protection. I was unconsciously tapping it against my leg, a nervous habit that I only became aware of when I saw her eyes tracking the movement. When I went around to investigate, there was no sign of anything. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to indicate that anyone else has been near the cabin. Megan absorbed this information in silence for several long moments. I could see her mind working, trying to process the implications of what I was telling her. Finally, she asked the question I had been dreading. "Do you think we should leave?" The question forced me to confront my own feelings about what had occurred. My first instinct was indeed to pack up immediately and retreat to the safety of civilization. Every primitive survival mechanism in my brain was screaming at me to get as far away from this place as possible. But another part of me, the rational, educated part that had spent decades teaching students to think critically about unusual phenomena, was reluctant to abandon our trip based on a single unexplained incident. "I don't think we're in any immediate danger," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced of this myself. Whatever I saw didn't seem aggressive or threatening. If it meant us harm, it would have had ample opportunity to act when I was standing right there. This reasoning seemed to provide some comfort to both of us, though I noticed that Megan remained tense and alert as we settled back onto the couch. I added several logs to the fire, partly for warmth, but mostly because the familiar activity helped calm my nerves. The routine task of feeding flames and arranging burning wood provided a welcome anchor to normalcy after the surreal events of the afternoon. We spent the remainder of the daylight hours in a state of heightened awareness, both of us listening carefully to every sound from outside the cabin. Every creak of settling wood, every rustle of wind through the trees, every distant bird call received our immediate attention. The peaceful sanctuary that the cabin had represented just hours earlier now felt like a vulnerable outpost surrounded by unknown threats. As evening approached and I began lighting the propane lanterns, I found myself frequently glancing toward the windows, checking for any signs of movement in the gathering dusk. The darkness that had seemed so welcoming on our first night now felt ominous and full of unseen possibilities. As twilight settled over the forest and the interior of the cabin took on the warm, flickering glow of lantern light, I attempted to restore some sense of normalcy by preparing dinner. Cooking had always been a meditative activity for me, requiring just enough concentration to quiet an overactive mind while producing tangible, comforting results. "Why don't you keep reading while I get our meal started?" I suggested to Megan, who had been casting nervous glances toward the windows every few minutes. "I'm making that pasta dish you liked so much last time I cooked it at home." She nodded gratefully and reopened her book, though I noticed her eyes rarely remained focused on the pages for more than a few seconds before darting back to the darkening windows. The normalcy I was trying to create felt fragile and artificial, like a thin veneer covering the underlying tension that had gripped us both since the afternoon's incident. I began by clearing the dishes we had left in the drying rack beside the sink from our hasty breakfast that morning. The simple ceramic plates and cups had been provided by the camp, sturdy utilitarian pieces that had undoubtedly served hundreds of guests over the years. As I transferred them to their proper storage locations in the cabinets above the counter, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. A large puddle of water had formed on the counter to the right of the sink, covering an area roughly the size of a dinner plate. The water was clear and odorless, appearing to be the same as what we had been using from our storage container. But the container itself sat on the opposite side of the sink, and I was certain the counter had been completely dry when we had left for our morning hike. I called Megan over to examine the mysterious puddle, hoping she might have some explanation for its presence. She studied the area carefully, running her finger through the water to test its properties, but appeared as puzzled as I was. "Could it have dripped from somewhere?" she asked, looking up toward the ceiling above the counter. I had already considered this possibility and grabbed a flashlight to conduct a thorough examination of the area above where the water had appeared. The log ceiling showed no signs of moisture, staining, or any other indication that water might have leaked through from outside. Moreover, the cabin's roof was steeply pitched specifically to shed precipitation quickly, making it highly unlikely that standing water could accumulate anywhere above the interior spaces. "There hasn't been any rain since early this morning," I pointed out. "And even if there had been, I don't see any way water could get through that roof." We checked the plastic water container for leaks, examining every inch of its surface and the area where it connected to the simple spigot near the sink. Everything appeared to be in perfect working order, with no signs of dripping or seepage. The mystery deepened when I realized that even if the container had been leaking, the water would have pooled directly beneath it rather than across the counter in the opposite direction. I mopped up the puddle with a kitchen towel and dismissed the incident as an unexplained oddity. Perhaps a previous guest had left wet dishes in that area, or maybe I had splashed water there myself without noticing. Though neither explanation felt entirely satisfactory, I was reluctant to assign sinister significance to every unusual occurrence. Opening the cardboard boxes of dry goods we had stored on the small table against the far wall, I reached for a package of pasta and immediately noticed that it felt wrong in my hands. Instead of the crisp, dry cardboard I expected, the box felt soft and damp, as if it had been soaked in water and was only now beginning to dry out. "Megan, come look at this," I called, holding up the soggy package. She examined the pasta box and then checked the others stored on the same table. Every single item, crackers, cereal, instant oatmeal, tea bags, showed signs of having been thoroughly saturated with water. The cardboard containers were all soft and discolored, with watermarks that indicated they had been sitting in standing liquid for some extended period. Beneath the boxes, the wooden table surface showed a large water stain that was still damp to the touch. The stain covered nearly the entire tabletop, as if someone had poured several gallons of water directly onto the surface and left it to soak into the wood. This discovery was far more disturbing than the puddle by the sink because it couldn't be explained by any conventional means. The table sat in the middle of the cabin's interior, well away from any potential source of water. There were no pipes, no fixtures, no windows directly above the area. Even if the roof had somehow leaked, which our examination had ruled out, water would have had to defy gravity to reach this location. "This doesn't make sense," Megan said, voicing what we were both thinking. "How did all this water get here?" I didn't have an answer for her. The physical evidence was undeniable. Our food supplies had been soaked while we were away from the cabin, but there was no rational explanation for how it could have happened. We checked every possible source of water in the cabin's interior, from the storage container to the primitive plumbing fixtures, but found no leaks or malfunctions that could account for the flooding. As I attempted to salvage what I could from our damaged supplies, transferring dry items to sealed containers and discarding those that had been ruined, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with something beyond normal experience. The water incidents, like the apparition I had witnessed that afternoon, seemed to violate the basic laws of physics that governed everyday reality. "Let's just focus on making dinner," I suggested, trying to maintain an atmosphere of normalcy despite my growing unease. "We can figure out the water problem later." But even as I filled a pot with water from our storage container and placed it on the wood stove to boil, I found myself anticipating the next inexplicable event. The cabin that had felt like a refuge from the complexities of modern life now seemed like a place where the fundamental rules of existence no longer applied. As we worked together to prepare our meal, carefully checking each ingredient for water damage, I caught myself frequently glancing toward the counter where I had first discovered the mysterious puddle. Part of me expected to see water materializing again from thin air, defying every rational principle I had spent my life accepting as absolute truth. Dinner proceeded quietly, both of us lost in our own thoughts as we tried to process the day's unsettling events. The pasta tasted fine, though I noticed we were both eating mechanically, without the relaxed enjoyment that had characterized our previous meals in the cabin. Every sound from outside, the settling of the building as temperatures dropped, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through pine branches, drew our immediate attention. As I washed our dishes in the simple sink, using water sparingly from our container, I found myself examining every surface for new signs of mysterious moisture. The counter remained dry, the table showed no fresh water stains, and our remaining supplies appeared untouched. Whatever force had caused the earlier flooding seemed to have subsided, at least temporarily. "I think I'm ready for bed," Megan announced as I finished cleaning up. This has been the strangest day of my life, and I'm emotionally exhausted. I understood exactly what she meant. The combination of physical exertion from our morning hike and the psychological stress of the afternoon's bizarre incidents had left us both drained. Sleep seemed like the best escape from the questions that had no satisfactory answers. As a precautionary measure, I dragged one of the metal folding chairs from the dining table and positioned it against the front door. The cabin had no locks, a deliberate choice by the camp's founders to maintain the atmosphere of trust and safety that had characterized this place for decades. But given the day's events, I felt better knowing that any attempt to open the door from outside would result in a loud crash as the chair toppled over. "Good thinking," Megan said, watching my improvised security system, "though I'm not sure what we're trying to keep out." That was precisely the problem. I had no idea what we might be dealing with, which made it impossible to take appropriate defensive measures. How do you protect yourself against something that defies rational explanation? In the bedroom, we prepared for sleep with nervous efficiency. I had positioned my sleeping bag so that my head would be near the interior wall, while Megan arranged hers with her head toward the exterior wall beneath the window. This placement had seemed perfectly natural the night before, but now I found myself wishing we had chosen different positions. If something approached the cabin from outside during the night, she would be the first to encounter it. "Try not to worry too much," I told her as I adjusted my pillow. "Whatever's happening here, it doesn't seem to be directly threatening us. We've been here 2 full days, and despite the strange incidents, neither of us has been harmed." She nodded, though I could see the tension in her shoulders as she settled into her sleeping bag. "I know you're right. It's just that everything feels so unpredictable now. I keep expecting something else to happen." I understood her anxiety completely. The sense of security that had defined this place for me over 30 years had been shattered in a single afternoon. The cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary from the outside world. Instead, it had become a stage where impossible events played out according to rules I couldn't begin to comprehend. As I lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest, I found my mind racing through possible explanations for what we had experienced. Could there be some kind of geological phenomenon at work? Underground springs or gas emissions that might create unusual atmospheric effects? Might the area be subject to some form of electromagnetic disturbance that could cause hallucinations or distort perception? None of these theories felt adequate to explain the specific details of what I had witnessed. The apparition above the wood rack had possessed a quality of substantiality and purpose that transcended any environmental anomaly, and the water incidents suggested intelligence behind the phenomena, as if something was deliberately trying to demonstrate its presence through actions that would be noticed but not immediately threatening. Hours passed as I lay there, alternating between attempts to fall asleep and periods of hyper-vigilant listening for any unusual sounds. Megan's breathing had gradually deepened and steadied, indicating that exhaustion had finally overcome her anxiety. I envied her ability to find rest, but my own mind remained stubbornly alert, analyzing every creak and rustle from the forest around us. Sometime around 3 a.m, I must have finally dozed off, because I was awakened by the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. It began as a faint scratching noise, so soft at first that I wasn't certain whether I was hearing it or dreaming it. But as I lay there with my eyes still closed, the sound grew steadily louder and more distinct. Something was dragging a sharp object along the exterior wall of the cabin, directly behind where Megan slept. The scratching had a deliberate, methodical quality that suggested intelligence and intent. It wasn't the random scraping of a tree branch moved by wind or the clawing of an animal seeking shelter. This was purposeful, controlled, almost ritualistic. As I listened in growing horror, the scratching sound began to move along the wall in my direction. It traveled slowly but steadily, growing louder with each passing second until it seemed to fill the entire room with its harsh, metallic resonance. The sound bypassed all rational thought and triggered every primitive fear response embedded in my nervous system. When the scratching reached the corner of the room and began moving along the wall behind my head, I felt as if the source was directly targeting me. It continued along the interior wall until it stopped at what felt like the exact midpoint of my body. There, the sound ceased abruptly, leaving a silence that was somehow more frightening than the noise itself. In that moment of absolute quiet, I began praying with an intensity I hadn't felt since childhood. "God, please don't let us be harmed," I whispered silently, repeating the plea over and over as I lay frozen beneath my covers. "Whatever this is, please protect us from it." The 30 seconds that followed the cessation of the scratching sound were the longest of my life. I lay perfectly still, every muscle tensed, waiting for something to happen. Would whatever was making the noise attempt to break through the wall? Would it circle around to try the door or windows? Was this merely a prelude to some more direct form of contact? But nothing happened. The silence stretched on, gradually being filled again with the normal sounds of the forest at night, the distant hooting of owls, the rustle of small animals foraging through fallen leaves, the gentle whisper of wind through evergreen branches. Whatever had been systematically scratching along the cabin's exterior walls had apparently departed as mysteriously as it had arrived. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, I finally found the courage to sit up in my sleeping bag. The movement seemed to trigger Megan's awakening, and she rolled over to face me with sleepy confusion. "Dad? What's wrong? You look terrible." I realized that despite the darkness, she could probably see the tension in my posture and the fear that I knew must be written across my features. "Did you hear anything just now? Any scratching sounds along the walls?" She shook her head, clearly puzzled by the question. "I was sleeping pretty deeply. Why? Did something happen?" Part of me was relieved that she hadn't been awakened by the terrifying sounds, but another part felt isolated by being the sole witness to this latest impossible event. How could scratching loud enough to wake me from sleep not have disturbed someone lying just a few feet away? Was I losing my grip on reality, or was there something about these phenomena that affected different people in different ways? "I heard something moving around the outside of the cabin," I said, choosing not to elaborate on the specific details. "It's probably nothing, but I want to get an early start this morning. How do you feel about packing up and heading home today instead of staying for our planned third night?" Relief flooded her expression so quickly that I realized she had been hoping for exactly this suggestion. "That sounds like a good idea," she said without hesitation. "I mean, it's been an amazing experience, but I think I've had enough wilderness adventure for one trip." We both understood that her diplomatic phrasing concealed a desperate desire to escape from whatever was happening at this place. The cabin that had promised peaceful retreat from civilization had become a source of inexplicable terrors that challenged our basic understanding of reality. I rebuilt the fire one last time, partly to provide warmth for our morning preparations, but mostly because the familiar task helped calm my shattered nerves. As coffee percolated on the wood stove, we efficiently packed our gear with the focused urgency of people fleeing a disaster zone. Every item was checked, rechecked, and secured for travel, as if our lives depended on leaving nothing behind. Breakfast was a hurried affair of instant oatmeal and coffee consumed while standing rather than sitting. Both of us seemed reluctant to settle into any routine that might delay our departure. I found myself frequently checking my watch, calculating how long it would take to complete our packing and make the quarter-mile walk back to the parking area. As I was loading our supplies into backpacks, I noticed that Megan kept glancing nervously toward the windows, as if expecting to see something looking back at her from the forest. Her anxiety was contagious, and I found myself doing the same thing, scanning the tree line for any signs of movement or unnatural presence. "Let me ask you something," I said as we made final preparations to leave. "Before we go, I want to check with the camp manager about whether other guests have reported unusual experiences in this cabin." Would you rather wait in the car while I do that, or come with me to the office? I'll come with you, she said immediately. I don't want to be alone anywhere on this property right now. I understood her feelings completely. The sense of safety that should have characterized this remote wilderness retreat had been completely shattered by events that defied rational explanation. Neither of us wanted to spend another moment here alone. We conducted a final inspection of the cabin's interior, ensuring that we had left everything clean and properly arranged for the next guests. The primitive accommodations that had seemed charming and romantic just 3 days earlier now felt ominous and forbidding. I was grateful to step outside and close the door for what I suspected would be the last time. The walk back to the parking area passed in tense silence, both of us alert for any unusual sounds or movements from the surrounding forest. Every snapping twig or rustling branch caused us to freeze momentarily, listening carefully before continuing our retreat. The familiar trail that had seemed like a pleasant woodland stroll when we arrived now felt like a gauntlet to be endured rather than enjoyed. When we finally reached my car and loaded our gear into the trunk, I felt a profound sense of relief that surprised me with its intensity. The simple act of sitting in the driver's seat and turning the key in the ignition represented a return to a world governed by predictable physical laws and rational cause and effect relationships. Before leaving the camp property entirely, I drove to the small administrative building where the camp manager maintained his office. Mr. Andrews had been overseeing this facility for nearly 15 years, and I hoped he might be able to provide some context for what we had experienced. "Any problems with Cabin 7?" he asked as I signed out and returned the key. "Actually, yes," I said, deciding to be direct about our experiences. "We had some unusual incidents that I wanted to ask you about. Have other guests reported anything strange happening in that particular cabin?" His expression immediately became more serious, and I noticed him glance quickly toward where Megan was waiting in the car. "What kind of unusual incidents?" I gave him a brief summary of the major events: the apparition above the wood rack, the mysterious water incidents, and the scratching sounds during the night. I watched his face carefully as I spoke, looking for any sign of recognition or understanding. When I finished, he was quiet for several long moments, clearly weighing his response carefully. Finally, he said, "This is the third report of unusual activity in Cabin 7 this season. I've been documenting these incidents and trying to decide whether we should take the cabin out of service temporarily." This revelation was both validating and deeply unsettling. On one hand, it confirmed that we hadn't imagined or exaggerated what had happened to us. Other people had experienced similar phenomena in the same location, suggesting that something genuinely anomalous was occurring there. On the other hand, the fact that the camp management was aware of ongoing problems but had continued renting the cabin raised serious questions about their responsibility to guest safety. "What exactly have other people reported?" I asked. "Similar things to what you've described," he said reluctantly. "Unexplained sounds, objects moving on their own, the appearance of water where none should be present. One family left in the middle of their first night, and a couple from Boston requested a different cabin after experiencing what they called impossible events." As we drove away from the camp that morning, I found myself looking back repeatedly in the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see something following us down the winding mountain road. It wasn't until we reached the main highway and began our journey back to civilization that I finally began to relax. The 3-hour drive home passed mostly in contemplative silence, both of us processing what we had experienced and trying to integrate it into our understanding of the world. By the time we reached familiar suburban streets, the events at the cabin had begun to take on an almost dreamlike quality, as if they had happened to someone else or in some alternate reality. But I knew I would never forget what I had seen above that wood rack, or the sound of purposeful scratching moving along the cabin's walls in the darkness. Something had shared that forest clearing with us, something that challenged every assumption I had ever made about the nature of reality. To this day, I have never returned to that camp, though I continue to receive their annual newsletters and promotional materials. The part of me that spent 30 years finding peace and renewal in that wilderness setting has been permanently altered by 3 days of impossible events that I cannot explain but can never deny. Sometimes, late at night when sleep proves elusive, I find myself wondering what would have happened if we had stayed for that third night as originally planned. Would the phenomena have escalated? Would we have gained some deeper understanding of what was sharing that space with us? Or would we have found ourselves confronting something far more directly threatening than mysterious scratches and unexplained water? I suppose I will never know the answers to those questions. But I am certain of one thing. There are aspects of our world that extend far beyond the boundaries of conventional scientific understanding, and sometimes, in remote places where civilization has barely left its mark, those hidden dimensions of reality become briefly visible to ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. The Adirondack Mountains continue to draw thousands of visitors each year, most of whom return home with nothing more unusual to report than spectacular sunsets and restorative solitude. But for my daughter and me, that particular corner of the wilderness will forever remain a place where the impossible briefly became real, leaving us with memories that no rational explanation can dismiss or diminish. The drive up to our family cabin in March of 2023 should have been peaceful. I was 24 then, old enough to appreciate the silence that comes with leaving the city behind, but young enough to still feel excitement about a week away from everything. My mother drove while my 15-year-old nephew sat in the back seat with our German Shepherd Ranger. The winding road through the Indiana hills seemed to stretch forever, each turn taking us deeper into the kind of wilderness that makes you remember how small you really are. The cabin sat perched on a ridge overlooking miles of dense forest. My grandfather had built it in the 1970s, and though we'd modernized it over the years with better insulation and a new roof, it still maintained that rustic charm that made you feel disconnected from the modern world. As we pulled into the gravel driveway, I noticed how the trees seemed to lean in closer than I remembered from previous visits. The bare branches created a web of shadows that moved and shifted with even the slightest breeze. "Looks like we're the only ones crazy enough to be up here this early in the season," my mother commented as she turned off the engine. She was right. Most of the neighboring cabins appeared empty, their windows dark and their driveways unplowed from the last snowfall. The isolation felt complete and absolute. Ranger immediately began pacing once we let him out of the car, his nose working overtime as he processed all the scents of the forest. I watched him carefully, noting how his ears kept swiveling toward the tree line as if he were listening for something specific. Dogs have always been more attuned to their surroundings than humans, and his behavior struck me as unusually alert for a place he'd visited many times before. By evening, we had settled into our familiar routines. The temperature had dropped significantly once the sun disappeared behind the hills, and the weather forecast promised several days of cold rain. Perfect conditions for staying indoors and enjoying the massive stone fireplace that dominated the cabin's main room. I built a fire while my mother unpacked groceries, and my nephew set up his gaming system, though the spotty internet connection made it more decorative than functional. The wood crackled and popped as the flames took hold, filling the room with dancing shadows and the comforting scent of burning oak. We pulled our chairs close to the hearth, and my mother produced her phone to find something to read aloud. She'd always been the storyteller in our family, and scary stories by firelight had become something of a tradition during our cabin visits. "Here's one that sounds appropriately creepy," she announced, scrolling through her screen. "It's about a family who keeps hearing things outside their remote cabin." The irony wasn't lost on me, but I settled back in my chair anyway, letting the warmth seep into my bones and my eyes drift shut. The fire provided just enough background noise to make everything feel secure and contained. For a moment, I felt that perfect sense of peace that comes from being completely disconnected from the outside world. That's when we heard it. The sound cut through the night air like a blade through silk. It wasn't quite a scream, and not exactly a howl, but something in between that made every muscle in my body tense. The sound seemed to come from directly behind the cabin, maybe 50 yards into the tree line. It lasted for maybe 3 seconds, rising in pitch before cutting off abruptly. I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Did you hear that?" My mother paused in her reading and looked up. "Hear what, honey?" "That sound, that howling or screaming or whatever it was." She glanced toward the windows, then back at me with a slightly confused expression. I didn't hear anything unusual. Maybe it was just the wind in the trees. But my nephew had heard something too. I could tell by the way he'd gone completely still, his game controller forgotten in his lap. His eyes were fixed on the back door, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. "You heard it, didn't you?" I asked him directly. He looked between my mother and me, then shrugged. "I thought I heard something, but Mom's probably right. Probably just the wind." The casualness of their responses felt wrong. The sound had been too distinct, too purposeful to dismiss so easily. And there had been no wind that evening. The air outside was still and heavy with approaching weather. The next morning brought the promised rain, and with it, a strange atmosphere that seemed to settle over the cabin like a heavy blanket. My mother made coffee and prepared breakfast as if nothing had happened, chatting about her plans to catch up on reading and maybe work on a jigsaw puzzle she'd brought along. My nephew retreated to his room with a stack of books, apparently resigned to a few days without reliable internet. I found myself drawn to the windows, studying the forest that surrounded us on 3 sides. In daylight, the trees looked innocent enough, just bare hardwoods and evergreens stretching as far as I could see. But something felt different about the way the shadows fell between the trunks, and I caught myself scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. "You're awfully quiet today," my mother observed as she joined me at the kitchen window. "Just thinking about that sound last night." She sighed and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Sweetie, I know being up here can make your imagination run wild, but there are lots of perfectly normal explanations for strange noises in the woods. Could have been a tree falling, or maybe a deer caught in some brush." Her explanation felt rehearsed, too convenient. And it didn't account for the fact that both my nephew and I had reacted to the sound before she'd even acknowledged hearing anything at all. That afternoon, while my mother napped and my nephew read in his room, I decided to take Ranger for a walk around the perimeter of our property. The rain had stopped temporarily, leaving everything dripping and fragrant with the smell of wet earth and decomposing leaves. Ranger seemed eager to explore, but I noticed he kept pulling toward the back of the cabin, toward the area where the sound had originated the night before. "What is it, boy?" I asked him, letting him lead me to the edge of the tree line. He stopped abruptly about 20 feet from the closest trees and began that low, rumbling growl that dogs make when they sense a threat. His hackles rose along his neck and back, and his body went rigid with attention. I followed his gaze into the shadows between the trees, but saw nothing unusual. "What's out there?" Ranger's growl intensified, and he took a step backward, pressing against my legs as if to push me away from whatever had captured his attention. I'd never seen him react this way to anything before. He was typically a confident, fearless dog who would investigate any new scent or sound with enthusiasm. We stayed there for several minutes, both of us staring into the forest, before I finally decided to retreat to the cabin. As we walked back, I could feel Ranger's tension in the way he kept looking over his shoulder, and I found myself doing the same thing. The second night brought more rain and an early darkness that seemed to press against the cabin windows like something alive. We'd settled into our evening routine: fire, comfortable chairs, and my mother's storytelling, but I found it impossible to relax. Every sound from outside made me jump, and I noticed that Ranger had positioned himself directly in front of the back door, as if standing guard. "You're making me nervous with all that fidgeting," my mother said gently. "Why don't you try to enjoy yourself? We're here to relax, remember?" I wanted to tell her that relaxation seemed impossible when every instinct I possessed was screaming that something was wrong, but I also didn't want to ruin the vacation for everyone else. So I forced myself to sit still and listen to her read from a collection of ghost stories she'd downloaded. The story she chose was about a family trapped in their home during a blizzard, hearing voices calling to them from outside. The parallels to our situation weren't lost on me, and I wondered if she'd selected it intentionally. As her voice rose and fell with the narrative, I found myself listening not just to her words, but to everything else as well. The fire crackling, the rain drumming on the roof, Ranger's occasional shifts in position. That's when the scratching started. It was so faint at first that I thought I might be imagining it. A soft, rhythmic scraping sound that seemed to come from directly above us, as if something were moving across the roof with deliberate slowness. I tilted my head, straining to isolate the sound from the rain and wind. "Mom, do you hear that scratching?" She paused in her reading and listened for a moment. "I hear the rain on the roof. That's probably all it is." But the sound was too regular, too purposeful to be random precipitation. It moved from one side of the roof to the other, paused, then reversed direction. Whatever was making the sound was large enough to create distinct footfalls on the wooden shingles. My nephew looked up from his book with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was fear there, certainly, but also something that looked almost like resignation, as if he'd been expecting this. "It's getting louder," I whispered. The scratching had indeed intensified, and now it was accompanied by a different sound, a low, throaty breathing that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Ranger rose to his feet and began pacing between the back door and the front windows, whining softly under his breath. "There's something on the roof," I said with more urgency. "And Ranger can hear it too. Look at him." My mother set down her phone and studied our dog for a moment. Even she couldn't deny his obvious distress. But instead of acknowledging the sounds that were growing more pronounced by the minute, she stood up and walked to the thermostat. "Maybe we should turn up the heat. Sometimes the heating system makes odd noises when it's working hard." Her explanation was absurd. We'd been coming to this cabin for years, and I knew every sound the heating system made. This was something else entirely, something that was moving around on our roof with increasing boldness. The scratching continued for another 10 minutes before gradually fading away, leaving behind only the sound of rain and my own racing heartbeat. I barely slept that night. Every small sound from outside had me sitting up in bed, straining to listen for the return of whatever had been moving around above us. Ranger had planted himself on the floor beside my bed and remained there until morning, occasionally lifting his head to listen before settling back down with a frustrated sigh. When dawn finally arrived, I was the first one awake. I dressed quickly and stepped outside to examine the roof and the area around the cabin. What I found made my stomach turn cold with dread. The soft earth around the cabin was marked with tracks. Not animal tracks, but something else entirely. They were roughly the size and shape of human footprints, but elongated and deeper than any normal person could make. The impression suggested something heavy moving on two legs, circling the cabin repeatedly throughout the night. Even more disturbing were the marks on the cabin itself. Long scratches had been gouged into the wooden siding near the back door, and several of the roof shingles showed signs of damage consistent with something large moving across them. The evidence was unmistakable. Something had been prowling around our cabin in the darkness. I called Ranger outside to see how he would react to the tracks. His response was immediate and dramatic. His hackles rose, He began that low growling again, and he refused to approach the marked areas despite my encouragement. Whatever scent lingered in those footprints was enough to terrify a 90-pound German shepherd. Find anything interesting? I spun around to find my mother standing in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, looking remarkably calm for someone whose vacation cabin had been vandalized during the night. Look at these tracks, I said, pointing to the clearest impressions in the mud. And look at the scratches on the siding. Something was here last night, something big. She stepped closer and examined the evidence with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Those are unusual, she admitted. Maybe we should call the local sheriff's office and report some vandalism. Her suggestion seemed reasonable on the surface, but something about her tone felt wrong. She was looking at clear evidence that something dangerous had been stalking around our isolated cabin, and her primary concern was filing a police report. Mom, I don't think this was vandalism. I think there's something living in these woods, something that's been watching us. She sipped her coffee and gazed out at the forest with an expression I couldn't interpret. Honey, I know this is frightening, but we can't let our imaginations get the better of us. There are reasonable explanations for everything we've seen and heard. But as she spoke, I noticed her eyes weren't focused on the trees. Instead, she seemed to be studying something specific in the distance, as if she were looking for something she expected to find there. That evening, I decided I couldn't continue pretending that everything was normal. The physical evidence, combined with the sounds we'd been hearing and Ranger's obvious distress, painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Something was stalking us, and my family's refusal to acknowledge the danger was becoming more disturbing than the threat itself. We need to talk, I announced as we gathered around the fire for our third night at the cabin. My mother looked up from her book with a patient smile. Of course, sweetheart, what's on your mind? This whole situation, the sounds, the tracks, the way you and David keep pretending nothing's happening. I need to understand what's going on. My nephew, David, shifted uncomfortably in his chair but didn't meet my eyes. My mother set down her book and gave me her full attention. I'm not pretending anything, she said carefully. I've acknowledged that we've heard some unusual sounds and seen some strange tracks. But I'm also trying to keep things in perspective. We're in the middle of the wilderness. Strange things happen in places like this. But that's just it, I pressed. You're not acting like someone who's concerned about strange things happening. You're acting like someone who knows exactly what's going on and doesn't want to talk about it. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. David continued to stare at his hands, while my mother seemed to be choosing her words very carefully. What exactly are you suggesting? She asked finally. I'm suggesting that both of you heard the same things I did, and both of you saw the same evidence I showed you this morning. But instead of being concerned or frightened or even curious, you're both acting like this is somehow normal or expected. Another long silence. Then David finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we should tell him. My mother's head snapped toward him with an expression of sharp warning. David. Tell me what? I demanded. David looked at my mother, then back at me. It's just, this isn't the first time this has happened. The words hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean, not the first time? My mother stood up abruptly and walked to the window, her back to both of us. David, that's enough. But David continued anyway, his words tumbling out in a rush. Last summer when we were here, and the time before that, always the same sounds, always the same tracks. Mom made me promise not to tell you because she said it would ruin the cabin for you. I felt the world tilt slightly as the implications of his words sank in. You've been coming here knowing that something dangerous stalks around the cabin at night, and you never told me? My mother turned back to face me, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I saw real fear in her eyes. "It's not dangerous," she said quietly. "It's never tried to get inside. It's never hurt anyone. It just watches." "How do you know it's not dangerous? How can you possibly know that?" She hesitated, then sank back into her chair with a heavy sigh. "Because your grandfather told me about it before he died. He said it had been coming around for years, probably decades. He called it the Watcher, said it was part of these woods, something that had always been here." The revelation left me speechless. My grandfather, who had built this cabin and spent countless nights here alone, had known about this thing and never warned any of us. "He said it was curious about people, but never harmful," my mother continued. "Like it was trying to understand us, but from a distance. He actually found it somewhat comforting in his later years, knowing something was keeping watch over the place." Armed with the truth, I found myself in an impossible position. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was lurking in those woods. But another part of me, the part that had inherited my grandfather's curiosity and stubbornness, wanted to stay and confront this mystery directly. My mother and David seemed relieved to have finally shared their secret, but they also made it clear that they expected me to accept the situation as they had. The Watcher was simply part of the cabin experience, something to be endured rather than understood or confronted. But I couldn't accept that level of passive resignation. If something had been observing our family for years, I wanted to know what it was and what it wanted. That night, I made a decision that probably wasn't very wise. Instead of hiding inside the cabin and waiting for the sounds to begin, I decided to position myself where I could observe the Watcher in return. I dressed in dark clothes, armed myself with a powerful flashlight and my grandfather's old hunting rifle, and slipped out the back door while my mother and David were settling in for the evening. I found a position about 50 yards from the cabin, behind a fallen log that provided both concealment and a clear view of the building. The night was cold and damp, with a thin mist rising from the forest floor that made everything beyond 20 feet look ghostly and indistinct. For the first hour, nothing happened. I began to wonder if my presence outside had somehow scared off whatever usually visited us. But then I heard it. The soft scraping sound of something moving through the underbrush approaching from deeper in the forest. The sounds grew closer, accompanied by that strange breathing I'd heard before. I gripped the rifle tighter and tried to control my own breathing as the noises circled around to the back of the cabin. Through the mist, I could make out a dark shape moving between the trees, taller than any animal but moving with an odd, hunched gait that didn't look entirely human either. The shape paused at the edge of the clearing, and I realized it was studying the cabin just as I was studying it. For several minutes we formed a strange triangle, the Watcher observing the cabin, me observing the Watcher, and my family inside, unaware that their secret was finally being exposed. Then the shape began to move again, circling the cabin with that same deliberate pattern I'd tracked in the mud. As it passed through a gap in the mist, I got my first clear look at what had been stalking us. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and covered in dark, matted hair that glistened with moisture from the mist. Its limbs were elongated and moved with an unsettling fluidity that suggested joints that bent in ways human joints shouldn't. But it was the face that made me grip the rifle with trembling hands. The features were almost human, but stretched and distorted as if someone had taken a person's face and pulled it like taffy. The eyes were large and dark, and they moved with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. As I watched in frozen fascination, the creature completed its circuit of the cabin and then did something that made my heart stop. It turned and looked directly at me. We stared at each other across the misty clearing for what felt like an eternity. Its dark eyes held mine with an intensity that spoke of recognition and perhaps even amusement. It had known I was there all along. Then it did something even more unsettling. It raised one elongated hand and waved. The wave was unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably intelligent, and unmistakably friendly. In that single gesture, the creature transformed in my mind from a source of terror to something far more complex and mysterious. It wasn't hunting us or threatening us, it was greeting me. I sat there for another 20 minutes, watching as the creature continued its patrol around the cabin, occasionally glancing in my direction as if to make sure I was still there. Its movements were careful and quiet, designed not to disturb the occupants inside. It really was just watching, just as my grandfather had said. Eventually, the creature melted back into the forest as silently as it had appeared, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and a completely transformed understanding of our situation. I waited another hour before returning to the cabin, where I found my mother sitting by the dying fire, clearly waiting for me. "You went out there, didn't you?" she said without looking up. "Yes." "And you saw it?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Your grandfather did the same thing his first summer here. Said he couldn't stand not knowing what was sharing the woods with him." I settled into the chair across from her, still processing what I'd experienced. "What is it?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Your grandfather had theories, but they were just guesses. He thought maybe it was something that had always lived in these hills, something that predated human settlement. He said the local Native American tribes had stories about forest watchers, guardians that kept track of who entered their territory." It waved at me. That made her smile for the first time since we'd arrived. "It waved at your grandfather, too. He said that was when he realized it wasn't something to be feared, just something to be respected." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the normal sounds of the forest settling into sleep. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me since David's revelation. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I was afraid you'd want to leave and never come back. This place has been in our family for 50 years. Your grandfather loved it here, and I love it here, and I want you to love it too. I thought if I could just get you used to the idea gradually, by lying to me about what I was hearing and seeing." She winced. "By protecting you from something you weren't ready to understand. But you're ready now, aren't you?" I considered the question seriously. The fear was still there. I doubted I'd ever be completely comfortable knowing that something was watching us from the darkness. But it was tempered now by curiosity and, strangely enough, a sense of connection to something larger than myself. "I think so," I said finally. We packed up and left the next morning, but not because of fear or disgust. Our week was simply over, and we all had responsibilities waiting for us in the real world. As we loaded the car, I found myself looking forward to our next visit rather than dreading it. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the tense silence we'd maintained for most of the week. David seemed relieved to have the family's secret finally out in the open, and my mother appeared genuinely happy that I'd accepted the truth about our unusual cabin guest. As we reached the bottom of the hill and the cabin disappeared behind the trees, I realized that my relationship with that place had been fundamentally changed. It was no longer just a family retreat. It was a bridge between our world and something ancient and mysterious that most people would never have the privilege to encounter. I'm already planning our next visit, and this time, I think I'll be ready to wave back. The trail seemed innocent enough on the map. Just another backcountry route through Black Ridge National Forest, a 6-day loop promising solitude and breathtaking vistas. I'd been planning this solo trek for months, ever since my job at the software company went remote. The isolation of constant screen time had driven me to seek something real, something primal. "You sure about going alone?" my coworker Michael had asked during our last video call. "Those northern woods get pretty remote." I dismissed his concerns with practiced confidence. "I've done plenty of weekend hikes. Besides, I've got satellite GPS and emergency beacon. Nothing to worry about." That conversation replayed in my mind as I shouldered my pack at the trailhead on a crisp September morning. The parking lot was deserted, except for my rental car, a fact that pleased rather than concerned me. The forest stretched before me, ancient pines standing like sentinels against the pale sky. The air carried the sharp scent of resin and wet earth. The first day's hike was moderate, a gradual 2,000-foot elevation gain over 8 miles. My boots crunched through fallen pine needles, the rhythm hypnotic as I adjusted to the weight of my pack. By early afternoon, patches of mist began threading between the trees, transforming the landscape into something from an old folktale. I made camp at a small clearing near a stream, moving through the familiar motions of setting up my tent and filtering water. The forest felt alive around me. Birds calling from unseen perches, small creatures rustling in the underbrush. It was exactly what I'd come for. After dinner, I sat beside my small camp stove, sipping instant coffee and watching darkness pool beneath the trees. That's when I heard it. A strange, ululating cry that seemed to skirt the edge between human and animal. I froze, cup halfway to my lips. The sound came again, farther away this time. A coyote, perhaps, or some bird I couldn't identify. Yet something about it raised the hair on my arms. I told myself it was natural to feel uneasy in unfamiliar territory. The wilderness operated on different rules than the sanitized world I'd come from. Sleep came fitfully that night. Each snap of a twig or distant call jolted me awake. Around 3 a.m., I emerged from my tent to relieve myself and paused, struck by the absolute stillness. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects chirping, no night birds calling. Even the stream seemed to have hushed its constant murmur. I scanned the trees, my headlamp cutting a weak cone through the darkness. Something reflected the light briefly, 2 points of yellowish gleam about 6 feet off the ground. Then they were gone. "Just an animal," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and unconvincing. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I kept my hunting knife close at hand. When dawn finally broke, I felt foolish for my midnight anxiety. The forest was alive again with birdsong and the rustling of small creatures. I broke camp efficiently, eager to reach the higher elevations where the views would open up. The trail grew steeper, switchbacking up a ridge through increasingly sparse vegetation. By noon, I'd gained enough elevation to look back over the vast wilderness I'd entered. Miles of unbroken forest stretched to the horizon, a dark green sea beneath the overcast sky. It was while taking in this view that I first noticed the footprints. They paralleled my own trail about 20 feet off the path, large, human-like impressions pressing deep into the soft forest floor. They hadn't been there on my ascent. Someone else was out here. That wasn't unusual in itself, but something about those tracks unsettled me. They appeared and disappeared at odd intervals, sometimes visible in patches of mud, then absent where they should have crossed open ground. A rumble of thunder prompted me to continue. The weather report had mentioned possible afternoon storms, and I wanted to reach my planned campsite before they hit. The footprints followed, always keeping pace, always just off trail. I quickened my steps, trying to outpace both the coming storm and my growing unease. The woods seemed to darken prematurely as clouds gathered overhead. When the rain finally came, it arrived in a sudden deluge that forced me to hastily erect my tent in a small clearing. Inside the relative safety of my nylon shelter, I listened to water hammering the rainfly and tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Another hiker, surely. Perhaps a forest ranger checking the backcountry. The rain continued for hours. As darkness fell, I strained to hear anything beyond the steady drumming of water. Occasionally, I caught what sounded like movement, something large displacing the underbrush, circling my campsite with deliberate, unhurried steps. I clutched my flashlight and knife, telling myself it was just a deer or elk seeking shelter. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever moved out there was watching me with cold, calculating intent. And somehow, I sensed it knew that I knew. Dawn broke with reluctant gray light filtering through the canopy. The rain had stopped, but fog clung to the trees, limiting visibility to a few dozen yards. I emerged from my tent to find the ground around my campsite unmarked. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. Yet the uneasy feeling remained, a persistent itch between my shoulder blades. I forced down a breakfast of instant oatmeal and packed quickly, eager to be moving. Today's route would take me along a ridgeline before descending into a valley said to contain one of the oldest growth forests in the region. Under different circumstances, I'd have been excited. The trail narrowed as it climbed, hugging the edge of steep drops that vanished into the fog below. I moved cautiously, one hand often reaching for tree trunks or rocks for balance. The mist created an eerie disconnect, as though the visible world ended just a few feet away. Around midday, the fog began to lift, revealing glimpses of the valley below. I paused at a rocky outcropping to rest and check my map. That's when I noticed the arrangement of stones near my feet. Not a natural formation, but 3 smooth river rocks balanced in a small pyramid. Someone had placed them there deliberately. A marker left by another hiker? Possibly. But the rocks were dry underneath, meaning they'd been placed after the rain stopped this morning. I scanned the surrounding forest but saw no one. Continuing along the ridge, I began finding more signs. Broken branches positioned to point in unnatural directions. Small cairns where no trail markers should be. Each discovery ratcheted my unease higher. Someone was moving through these woods parallel to me, leaving signs I couldn't fully interpret. By mid-afternoon, I began my descent into the valley. The trail switched back down through increasingly dense forest, the ancient trees blocking much of the fading daylight. The shifting shadows played tricks on my peripheral vision, darting movements that vanished when I turned to look directly. I found my designated campsite near a small pond. Park regulations required backcountry campers to use established sites, but I almost wished I could push on. Something about this place felt wrong, the water too still, the surrounding trees too watchful. As I set up camp, I discovered a crude figure hanging from a nearby branch, twigs bound together with what looked like animal sinew to form a humanoid shape. My first thought was vandalism, some teenager's idea of a Blair Witch reference. But the craftsmanship suggested something older, more purposeful. I left it untouched and focused on securing my camp before darkness fell. The pond's surface reflected the deepening sky, a perfect mirror until ripples suddenly spread across it. I hadn't seen anything break the surface. That night I built a larger fire than necessary, the flames offering both warmth and psychological comfort. The forest sounds seemed normal. Frogs croaking near the pond, an occasional owl call. But underneath ran a current of wrongness I couldn't place. I was adding another log to the fire when I saw it. A shape at the forest's edge, tall and impossibly thin. For a moment I thought it was just another tree trunk. Then it moved. My body froze while my mind raced. The figure stood partially hidden behind a large pine, but I could make out a human-like silhouette. It remained perfectly still, watching. I reached slowly for my knife. "Hello?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know you're there." No response, no movement, just patient, predatory stillness. I grabbed my flashlight and directed the beam toward the spot, but found only empty forest. Whatever I'd seen had vanished, or never been there at all. Yet the feeling of being observed intensified, pressing against me like a physical weight. Sleep was impossible. I kept the fire burning through the night, listening to the forest and trying to distinguish normal sounds from potential threats. Occasionally, branches would crack in the distance, always from a different direction, as if something was circling my camp. Shortly before dawn, I dozed off despite my intentions to remain alert. I awoke with a jolt to find my fire reduced to embers and something placed at the edge of my campsite, a freshly killed rabbit, its neck broken and body arranged with unnatural precision. The message was clear. While I slept, something had approached close enough to leave this offering. I abandoned any pretense of normal camping routine, hastily packing my essential gear and leaving the rest behind. My only thought was to reach the ranger station marked on my map about 15 miles ahead. As I shouldered my lightened pack, movement caught my eye. Something large passing between distant trees. The glimpse was too brief to identify, but the impression lingered. A figure walking upright but moving with animal fluidity. Its outline somehow wrong against the morning light. I took one last look at my abandoned campsite and the grotesque gift left for me. Then I ran. The trail descended through stands of ancient hemlock, their massive trunks creating a labyrinth of shadows. I moved as quickly as safety allowed, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The heavy silence of the forest pressed against my ears. No birdsong, no rustling of small creatures. Everything was holding its breath. According to my map, the trail should intersect with a fire road about 7 miles ahead. From there, I might encounter other hikers or forestry workers. The thought spurred me on despite my burning lungs and aching legs. Around noon, I paused beside a small stream to refill my water bottle. As I crouched at the water's edge, something caught my attention. A reflection in the clear surface that didn't match the surroundings. I jerked upright, scanning the opposite bank. Nothing visible, but the sense of being watched intensified. I abandoned the water and pushed on, the back of my neck prickling with awareness of unseen eyes. The forest gradually changed character, the old growth giving way to younger trees with dense undergrowth. The trail narrowed, forcing me to push through shoulder-high ferns that limited visibility to a few feet ahead. Each step became an act of faith, each turn revealing only more green tunnel. I was fighting through a particularly thick section when I found the first trap. A nearly invisible line of braided animal sinew stretched across the path at ankle height. Had I been moving at my earlier pace, I would have tripped directly into a bed of sharpened sticks positioned to impale whatever fell upon them. My blood turned to ice water. This wasn't some forest predator or territorial animal. This was calculated human malevolence. I carefully stepped over the trap and continued with heightened caution, scanning the ground before each step. 2 more traps appeared in the next mile. One, a pit disguised with a covering of branches and leaves. Another, a deadfall triggered by a tripwire. Who would set such things in a national forest? My mind recalled stories of hermits and isolationists who sometimes claimed wilderness territories as their own, attacking those they considered trespassers. But these traps felt different. Not the work of someone trying to keep people away, but of someone herding me in a specific direction. By mid-afternoon, I realized I'd lost the official trail. The path I was following appeared well used, but didn't match my map. Had I missed a turn, or had I been deliberately led astray? The canopy had thickened again, making it impossible to get my bearings from the sun. I came to a small clearing and stopped to check my GPS device. Dead. The battery had been nearly full that morning. My phone showed no signal, as expected, but its compass app still functioned. According to the digital needle, I was heading northwest, away from the ranger station. Anxiety threatened to overwhelm me. I forced myself to breathe deeply and think logically. The fire road should lie directly east. I would forge my own path if necessary. As I turned to leave the clearing, I spotted something that froze the breath in my lungs. A crude structure hidden among the trees at the far edge. At first glance, it resembled a hunting blind, but closer inspection revealed something more disturbing. The small shelter was constructed of interwoven branches and animal hides stretched over a frame of lashed-together saplings. Bones hung from the edges, small mammals and birds mostly, but some larger specimens I couldn't identify. The entrance gaped like a black mouth, revealing nothing of the interior. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming to run in the opposite direction. A nauseating smell emanated from the structure, the metallic scent of blood mixed with something musky and feral. Just outside the entrance lay a collection of items that stopped me cold. A broken compass, the shredded remains of a hiking boot, a twisted frame of what might once have been a backpack, trophies, or warnings. A sound behind me, the snap of a twig, deliberate and close. I spun around to face empty forest, then heard it again, from a different direction. My pursuer was toying with me. I backed away from the shelter, trying to maintain awareness in all directions. Another snap, closer still. Then silence, more terrifying than any noise could be. The attack, when it came, was nearly silent. A rush of movement from my left. A dark shape hurtling through the undergrowth. I caught a glimpse of something wearing what looked like animal furs, moving with a terrible loping speed. I ran blindly, crashing through brush and branches, aware of pursuit behind me. My foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling. As I scrambled to rise, I caught sight of my pursuer for the first time. The figure stood about 20 yards away, partially concealed by a tree trunk. Its form was human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too angular, joints bending in unnatural ways. It wore what appeared to be a crudely stitched covering of animal pelts and a headdress that incorporated antlers or bones. The face remained in shadow, but I could feel its gaze with physical intensity. For several heartbeats, neither of us moved. Then it raised one hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or threat. I didn't wait to find out which. I ran again, no longer caring about direction or stealth, driven by pure survival instinct. Branches whipped my face. Thorns tore at my clothing. Behind me came sounds of pursuit. Not directly behind, but paralleling my course, sometimes drawing closer, sometimes falling back. I realized with growing horror that I was being herded, driven in a specific direction by an intelligence that knew these woods intimately. Each time I tried to veer eastward, the sounds of pursuit intensified, forcing me back on a northerly course. The forest began to thin, and ahead I glimpsed what appeared to be the edge of a cliff or steep drop-off. The pursuing sounds converged from both sides now, leaving me only one direction: forward. I burst from the tree line onto a rocky ledge overlooking a river gorge perhaps 100 feet below. The water looked distant and unreachable, white rapids threading between sharp rocks. I turned to face the forest, knife in hand, back to the precipice. The trees remained still and silent. Nothing emerged. After long minutes, I began to wonder if I'd imagined the pursuit entirely. As the adrenaline ebbed, rational thought returned. I checked my compass again. The gorge ran roughly east-west. If I could find a way down to the river, it might lead me to civilization. Rivers always do. I moved carefully along the ledge, searching for a descent route. As I did, something caught my eye on a rock near the cliff edge. Fresh claw marks, deep and deliberate, forming a crude symbol I didn't recognize. A message, or a claim, and the certainty that whatever hunted me was far from finished. The gorge stretched before me with no visible path down. I followed the ridgeline eastward as afternoon light began to fade, hoping to find a break in the cliff face. My pursuer remained hidden, but occasional sounds from the forest confirmed its continuing presence. Patient, monitoring, waiting for darkness. After 2 miles of increasingly difficult terrain, I found what I was looking for. A steep but manageable descent where a landslide had created a rough natural staircase to the river below. I began picking my way down, testing each foothold before committing my weight. The river roared louder as I descended, its voice drowning out any sounds of pursuit. This bothered me more than it should have. At least before, I'd had some awareness of the creature's location. Now I felt blind, vulnerable. By the time I reached the river's edge, dusk was settling over the gorge. The water moved too swiftly for safe crossing, but a narrow game trail followed the bank heading downstream. I took it, moving as quickly as the fading light allowed. The walls of the gorge loomed on either side, cutting off the last daylight and plunging the river into premature night. I activated my flashlight, knowing it made me visible but having no choice if I wanted to avoid a fatal misstep. The trail occasionally vanished, forcing me to climb over boulder fields or wade through shallow sections of the river. My boots and pants became soaked, adding to my misery as temperature dropped with nightfall. Around what I estimated to be midnight, I came upon a natural alcove in the canyon wall, a shallow cave offering some shelter from the increasing wind. Exhaustion overwhelmed caution, and I decided to rest. The cave's narrow entrance would at least prevent anything from approaching unseen. I huddled against the back wall, facing the entrance with my knife and flashlight ready. Outside, the river's constant voice masked other sounds. The darkness beyond my small circle of light seemed absolute. Sleep came in fitful bursts, each awakening bringing momentary panic. During one such episode, I became aware of a change. The cave seemed darker. I raised my flashlight to find the entrance partially blocked by a crude arrangement of branches and rocks, clearly placed there while I'd slept. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hadn't heard a thing over the river's noise. Whatever stalked me had approached close enough to begin sealing me in, and might still be just outside. I moved to the entrance and cautiously pushed aside the barricade. The night beyond appeared empty, but the absolute certainty of being watched settled over me like a physical weight. Sleep was no longer an option. I spent the remaining hours until dawn in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every shift of shadow or change in the river's voice. Sometime before morning, a scraping sound came from the roof of the cave, something moving across the rock above me. When first light finally came, I emerged cautiously to find fresh tracks in the mud near the entrance. Not quite human, not quite animal. The impressions were deep, as if made by something heavier than its size would suggest. They approached the cave directly, then circled around to the side where a path led up to the top of the alcove. I didn't wait to see what other signs morning might reveal. I continued downstream, moving faster now with improved visibility. The gorge gradually widened, the walls becoming less steep. By mid-morning, I found what looked like an old logging road intersecting the river at a shallow ford. The road was overgrown but still visible, heading east through thinning forest. Hope surged for the first time in days. I pushed on with renewed energy, following the dirt track as it wound through stands of younger trees and occasional clearings. Around noon, I found the first sign of human presence, an old fire ring with relatively recent ashes. Someone had camped here within the past week. I searched the site thoroughly, finding a discarded energy bar wrapper with part of a manufacturing date still visible. Recent. The road improved as I continued, showing occasional tire tracks in muddy sections. By late afternoon, I spotted a structure through the trees, an old fire lookout tower standing on a cleared hilltop. I approached cautiously, years of wilderness experience warring with desperate need for help. The tower appeared maintained but currently unmanned, its metal stairs leading up to a small cabin, perhaps 40 feet above ground. The door at the base of the stairs was unlocked. A sign indicated the tower was open to hikers during daylight hours, but not for overnight use. I ignored this directive and climbed quickly, wanting height and visibility more than anything else. The cabin at the top was small but well equipped. A desk with radio equipment, maps on the walls, basic emergency supplies. Most importantly, it offered 360-degree views of the surrounding forest. I tried the radio immediately, but received only static across all frequencies. A logbook on the desk showed the tower was checked weekly during fire season, with the last entry dated just 3 days ago. Help would come, if I could just hold out. As afternoon faded toward evening, I scanned the forest edge with obsessive regularity. For hours, nothing moved except wind-blown branches. Then, as sunset painted the western sky in bloody streaks, I spotted it, a figure emerging from the tree line directly below the tower. Through binoculars found in the cabin, I finally saw my pursuer clearly. The sight defied easy description. A human form, certainly, but moved with an unnatural, jerking gait. It wore a covering made from multiple animal hides stitched together, and a headdress incorporating a deer skull with antlers intact. Where its face should have been visible beneath this grotesque helmet, there was only shadow. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring up at the tower. Even from 40 feet above, I felt pinned by that invisible gaze. It raised one arm in that same ambiguous gesture I'd seen before, then deliberately walked the perimeter of the clearing, never taking its attention from the tower. I watched, transfixed, as it completed a full circuit, then returned to its starting point. There it began what I can only describe as a ritual, moving in patterns that seemed both random and precisely calculated, occasionally stopping to scrape marks in the earth or arrange small objects it carried. As darkness fell, I lost sight of the figure, but could hear activity continuing below. Scraping sounds, the crack of breaking branches, something being dragged across the ground. I kept all lights off, not wanting to silhouette myself in the windows. Around midnight, the sounds stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any noise, an expectant, predatory hush. I strained to hear anything over the pounding of my own heart. The first impact against the tower's base came without warning, a heavy, deliberate thud that vibrated through the metal framework. Then another, and another. Not random attacks, but rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat. Testing the structure, or sending a message. The impacts continued for perhaps 20 minutes, then ceased. In the silence that followed, I heard a new sound. The distinctive creak of weight on the metal stairs. Step by step, methodical and unhurried, something was ascending toward the cabin. I braced a chair against the hatch that served as the cabin's only entrance, then retreated to the far side, knife in hand. The creaking progress continued until it reached the top. The hatch handle turned, found resistance, then stopped. Silence again, stretching interminably. Then a scraping directly against the outside wall of the cabin, something circling the small structure, testing each wall, each window. Occasionally, a shadow would pass across the glass, blocking the faint starlight. This psychological siege continued through the night. Periods of activity followed by unnerving silence, then renewed attempts to find weakness in my refuge. I remained motionless, conserving energy, mind oscillating between terror and a strange, detached analysis of my situation. As pre-dawn light began to filter through the trees, the presence withdrew. I heard its descent on the metal stairs, then watched through binoculars as it crossed the clearing toward the forest edge. At the tree line, it turned for one final look at the tower. In daylight, what I saw made no logical sense. The figure's proportions seemed to shift as it moved, its silhouette changing subtly against the dark trees. It raised both arms in a gesture that might have been supplication or threat, then slipped into the forest and was gone. But it had left something behind. In the center of the clearing, visible now in growing daylight, was an arrangement that turned my blood to ice, my own discarded gear from the abandoned campsite, arranged in a crude human shape. A message, unmistakable in its intent, You are not escaping. The day passed in tense vigilance. I searched the tower thoroughly, looking for anything that might help my situation. The emergency supplies included water purification tablets, some preserved food, a first aid kit, and a flare gun with 3 rounds. The radio remained stubbornly silent despite my repeated attempts across all frequencies. Most valuable was a detailed topographical map covering the entire region. I located the tower's position and traced potential routes to civilization. The nearest ranger station was approximately 18 miles east, but the terrain between looked challenging, a series of ridges and valleys with few established trails. More concerning was what I found in the tower's logbook. Between mundane entries about weather conditions and fire risk, I discovered a pattern. References to unusual activity and unexplained sightings stretching back several seasons. The most recent entry, from just 3 days ago, included a cryptic note. Found more structures in North Quadrant. Reported to HQ. No response yet. As afternoon waned, I faced a difficult decision. The logbook indicated the next scheduled check wouldn't happen for 4 days. Could I last that long under siege? Or should I attempt to reach help on my own? The creature's behavior suggested it was playing a calculated game. It could have attacked directly many times, but chose psychological warfare instead. This realization didn't comfort me. Whatever hunted me was intelligent, patient, and intimately familiar with these woods. I decided to leave at first light. Remaining meant eventual dehydration or starvation if help didn't arrive. At least movement offered some chance, however slim. That night passed in similar fashion to the previous one. Intermittent testing of the tower's structure, occasional ascents of the staircase, and that same unnerving circling of the cabin. I didn't sleep, but conserved energy and planned my route for morning. Dawn came with unexpected fog, thick white mist that limited visibility to a few dozen yards. It wasn't ideal for navigation, but provided cover I desperately needed. I packed what supplies I could carry from the tower, including the flare gun, and descended cautiously, scanning constantly for movement in the surrounding whiteness. The clearing seemed abandoned, but the arrangement of my gear remained in the center, a grotesque scarecrow marking what felt increasingly like my own grave. I skirted it widely and headed east, compass in hand. The fog muffled sound and distorted distance, transforming the forest into an alien landscape. I moved as quietly as possible, stopping frequently to listen for pursuit. For the first hour, I detected nothing unusual, just the drip of condensation from leaves and the occasional call of a bird. By mid-morning, the fog began to lift, revealing a landscape of steep ridges and narrow valleys. I maintained my eastward heading, sometimes having to detour around impassable terrain, but always returning to my chosen direction. Around noon, I found the first sign that I was being followed. A crude marker fashioned from twisted branches pointing in the direction I had just come from. It hadn't been there when I passed earlier. My pursuer was not only tracking me, but moving ahead to leave these taunting signs. I quickened my pace despite growing fatigue. The terrain grew increasingly difficult. Loose shale slopes that threatened to send me sliding. Thick understory that clutched at my legs. Stream crossings where the water ran swift and cold. By late afternoon, I reached the base of a particularly steep ridge. According to my map, once over this obstacle, the land would gradually descend toward the ranger station. I began the climb, muscles protesting after days of constant exertion and minimal rest. Near the summit, I found another marker, this one more elaborate, a small collection of bones arranged in a spiral pattern, with a central space containing what looked disturbingly like a human molar. I forced myself not to think about its origin. The ridge top offered a momentary sense of achievement. Below stretched a valley that eventually opened onto what appeared to be logged areas, signs of human activity. perhaps 3 or 4 hours of travel if I maintained my pace. I had just started my descent when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in any natural forest. A rhythmic clicking, like bone striking bone, emanating from the ridgeline behind me. I didn't turn to look. I ran. The downslope was treacherous, loose rocks and exposed roots threatening to send me tumbling. I abandoned caution for speed, using trees to break my descent where possible. The clicking sound continued, sometimes fading, sometimes growing louder, but always present. At the valley floor, I encountered a small stream and followed it eastward. The banks were overgrown, but provided clear direction. As twilight approached, I faced the reality that I wouldn't reach civilization before dark. I needed shelter, somewhere defensible to wait out the night. The stream had carved a small ravine in places, with undercut banks and exposed root systems of large trees. One such hollow looked promising, a cavity beneath a massive old-growth evergreen, partially screened by fallen branches. I crawled inside and arranged the branches to better conceal the entrance. The space was cramped but offered good visibility of the approaching stream bed, while hiding me from casual observation. Darkness fell with the suddenness particular to forests. I didn't dare use my flashlight, instead relying on increasingly dilated pupils to make out shapes in the gloom. The stream's gentle voice provided some cover for small movements, but also masked sounds of approach. I don't know exactly when I became aware of the presence. There was no sound, no visual cue, just an absolute certainty that something waited nearby. I controlled my breathing, trying not to make the slightest noise, while straining to detect movement in the darkness. A soft scraping sound came from directly above. Something moving across the top of my shelter. Dirt and small debris filtered down through the roots, forming my ceiling. The weight moved methodically, testing different sections of the ground above. I clutched the flare gun, considering my options. Firing would reveal my position absolutely, but might drive the creature away temporarily. Or it might provoke a direct attack. I decided to wait. Hours passed in this suspended state, the presence above occasionally shifting position but never leaving. Once, a small object dropped through the roots and landed beside me. A carved wooden figure, humanoid but with exaggerated limbs and an animal-like head. A calling card, left deliberately. Shortly before dawn, the heaviness above receded. I remained motionless, suspecting a trap. When faint light finally began filtering through the trees, I cautiously emerged, every sense alert for danger. The stream bed appeared empty in both directions. On the ground above my shelter, I found disturbed earth and a clear impression, as if something heavy had lain there through the night, watching, waiting, perhaps listening to my terrified heartbeat just inches below. I resumed my eastward journey immediately, following the stream as it widened and joined a larger waterway. The forest began showing signs of human management, younger stands of trees in regular patterns, occasional cut stumps, and finally, a narrow dirt road paralleling the water. Hope surged. I increased my pace despite exhaustion. The road gradually improved, showing tire tracks and eventually widening enough for vehicle passage. By mid-morning, I spotted what looked like a building through the trees ahead. I approached cautiously, having learned harsh lessons about false security. It was an old logging shed or equipment storage, abandoned but relatively intact. No vehicle was present, but boot prints in the mud suggested recent human visitation. Inside, I found basic tools, some empty fuel containers, and, most precious, a two-way radio on a shelf. I activated it with trembling hands and was rewarded with the crackle of static. I cycled through channels until I found one with audible voices, then pressed the transmit button. Emergency. Hiker in distress. Located at old logging shed east of Black Ridge Valley. Being pursued. Need immediate assistance. The response was immediate but broken, Signal fading in and out. Copy that. Location again. Sending. Stay put. Relief nearly overwhelmed me. Help was coming. I just needed to hold out. I secured the shed as best I could, using tools to reinforce the single door and small window. Then I took up position where I could watch the approach from the forest while maintaining access to the radio. As afternoon stretched toward evening, a new sound reached me. The distant but unmistakable drone of a vehicle engine. I almost wept with relief. But as the sound grew closer, another awareness dawned. A presence in the forest edge opposite the road. A figure partially concealed by shadows, watching the shed with unnerving stillness. The antlered silhouette was unmistakable. We both heard the approaching vehicle. The figure made no move to retreat, instead stepping partially into clearer view. For the first time, I witnessed a display that seemed like genuine emotion. A posture of rage or defiance directed not at me but at the approaching intrusion. The creature turned its antlered head toward me one final time. Even without seeing its face, I understood the message. This isn't over. Then it was gone, melting into the forest with unnatural speed just as headlights appeared on the access road. The forestry service truck pulled up outside the shed, and two uniformed rangers emerged, looking concerned and confused. I stumbled outside, babbling my story in disconnected fragments. They exchanged glances I couldn't interpret, then helped me into their vehicle. As we drove away, I kept my eyes fixed on the darkening forest edge, certain that somewhere in those shadows, patient yellow eyes were watching, waiting. The threat had retreated, but not disappeared. And deep down, I knew with terrible certainty that the wilderness held secrets most of us are never meant to uncover. Territories where the line between predator and prey, between human and other, blurs into meaninglessness. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Some watchers aren't meant to be seen. The rangers took me to a small outpost where I gave a formal statement. Their reactions ranged from professional concern to poorly concealed skepticism. They documented my injuries, the condition of my equipment, and took detailed notes about my encounter locations. One of them, an older man with weathered features, asked fewer questions, but watched me with unsettling intensity. When I finished my account, the younger ranger left to make some calls. The older one, Ranger Blackburn according to his nameplate, remained behind. "Not the first report we've had," he said quietly, once we were alone. "Not even the 10th. I stared at him, processing the implications. Official position is cougar activity, maybe bears. Territorial behaviors misinterpreted by exhausted hikers. He shrugged. Paperwork's easier that way. But you don't believe that, I said. He studied me for a long moment. 26 years in these forests, seen things that don't fit neat explanations, tracks that change character mid-stride, structures no local would build, hunters gone missing where they shouldn't. Why don't you warn people? About what exactly? Warn them that the most remote sections of wilderness might contain something that doesn't appear in any wildlife manual? He shook his head. Tourism board would love that. The conversation ended when the younger ranger returned. I was transported to the nearest hospital for treatment of dehydration, exposure, and various minor injuries. The doctors were professional but distant, clearly attributing my psychological state to trauma and exhaustion. I was released after 2 days and gave additional statements to local police and Forest Service officials. My account was recorded, filed, and effectively buried. The official report cited an unfortunate combination of poor preparation, navigation errors, and wildlife encounters. I returned home to concerned friends and a backlog of work emails. Superficially, life resumed its normal rhythm. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Sleep became my enemy. Each night brought dreams of being pursued through endless forests by a patient, calculating presence. I would wake gasping, certain something was watching from the darkened corners of my bedroom. Rational thought provided no defense against these visceral reactions. I researched obsessively, spending hours scouring internet forums and obscure anthropological journals. Reports existed, scattered, often ridiculed, but showing disturbing consistencies. Encounters in remote areas with figures described as wearing animal hides and antlers or horns. Unexplained structures deep in wilderness areas. Patterns of stalking behavior lasting days. Most accounts ended with the person escaping to civilization. A few ended differently, discovered only as brief mentions in missing persons databases or local newspaper archives. 3 weeks after my return, a small package arrived at my apartment. No return address, postmarked from the small town nearest to Blackridge Forest. Inside was a folded note and a small wooden carving, identical to the one dropped into my shelter that final night. The note, written in cramped handwriting, contained just 3 lines. Boundary crossed. Recognition established. It remembers your scent. It knows where you live. I moved the following week, changing my name and leaving no forwarding address. I abandoned social media and cut ties with anyone connected to my previous life. Some might call it paranoia. I consider it survival. I live now in a small apartment in a crowded city, as far from wilderness as I can manage. Yet sometimes, catching a glimpse of parkland trees from my window, I feel that familiar prickle between my shoulder blades, the certainty of being observed by patient, calculating eyes. Most disturbing are the small signs, arranged twigs on my windowsill, unaccountable scratching at my door in the dead of night, the occasional glimpse of an antlered silhouette reflected in windows of buildings across the street. Boundaries mean nothing to it. Distance is merely an inconvenience. Civilization offers the illusion of protection, nothing more. I write this account not as warning. Those who need warning won't recognize the danger until too late, but as testimony. Something ancient and other shares our world, dwelling in the diminishing spaces between human territories. It watches from forest shadows, learning our patterns, testing our defenses. And sometimes, when it finds a human who strays too far into its domain, it follows them home. Listen carefully tonight. That sound, branches against your window or fingers. That shadow, just clothes hanging in your closet, or something watching, waiting. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Some watchers aren't meant to be seen. And some pursuits never truly end.